For years, James Best made millions of Americans laugh without ever raising his voice. As Sheriff Roscoe, he turned chaos into comedy and clumsiness into charm. But behind that familiar smile was a man who believed deeply in discipline, preparation, and respect. And one day, on a set that looked carefree to the world, James Best drew a line so final that it changed everything, without anyone at home ever noticing. The man behind Roscoe. To the audience, James Best was pure mischief. Sheriff Roscoe P. Coltrane stumbled through Hazard County with wide eyes, frantic radio calls, and a laugh that felt larger than life. He crashed patrol cars, botched arrests, and chased the Duke boys with endless enthusiasm, only to fail spectacularly every time. The role was physical, loud, and deliberately foolish. It was designed to make children laugh and adults smile. And James Best made it unforgettable. But the man playing Roscoe was the opposite of the character he portrayed. By the time the Dukes of Hazzard went into production, James Best was already a veteran shaped by a very different Hollywood. He had come up in an era where arriving early was expected, where lines were memorized before stepping onto the set, and where rehearsal was not optional. Long before Hazard County existed, Best had built a career grounded in discipline. He had trained under Lee Strasberg, absorbing a method that demanded seriousness, internal logic, and absolute respect for the craft. Acting, to him, was not instinct alone. It was responsibility. His resume reflected that mindset. Over decades, he appeared in hundreds of television episodes across some of America's most respected series. He worked alongside legends, not as a star chasing attention, but as a professional others relied on. Directors trusted him because he never wasted time. Crews respected him because he never showed up unprepared. And younger actors learned from him, whether they realized it or not. When Best accepted the role of Roscoe, he did not see it as a silly paycheck. He saw it as a challenge. The character on the page was broad and cartoonish. Best believed that even comedy required structure. He studied Roscoe's movements, rhythms, and emotional beats. He rewrote dialogue to sharpen timing. He refined gestures so they felt intentional, not random. What viewers saw as spontaneous chaos was, in reality, carefully constructed. On set, his habits stood out immediately. Crew members noticed that he arrived earlier than almost everyone else, often at least 30 minutes before call time. His scripts were marked with underlines, arrows, and notes detailing where he would move, pause, or shift his expression. If blocking rehearsals were rushed or skipped, Best did not complain loudly. He simply asked calmly for a moment to confirm the movement. To him, that was not perfectionism, it was respect. This approach earned him admiration from some and quiet confusion from others. Catherine Bach often spoke of how he reminded the cast to stay focused, especially during long days. Denver Pyle, another seasoned actor, shared Best's old-school values and understood why preparation mattered. Between them, there was an unspoken understanding. Comedy only works when everyone takes it seriously. But The Dukes of Hazzard was not a traditional production, and it was about to become something far bigger than anyone expected. Within weeks of its debut, the show exploded. Ratings surged. Merchandise flooded stores. Suddenly, what began as a modest series turned into a national phenomenon. With success came pressure. Scripts arrived faster, stunts became bigger, schedules tightened. The production moved at a pace few television shows had attempted before. A set that moved too fast. The success of The Dukes of Hazzard changed everything almost overnight. What had started as a modest television production quickly turned into one of the most watched programs in America. With that success came pressure. Pressure that reshaped the working environment in ways few people were prepared for. The production schedule tightened dramatically, leaving little room for the careful preparation James Best believed was essential to good work. Filming originally began in Georgia, but the rapid rise in popularity pushed the studio to relocate production to California for logistical control. That move came with a punishing rhythm. Episodes were now completed in 7 to 8 days, an unusually fast turnaround even by television standards. The crew worked 6 days a week with minimal rest, moving directly from one episode to the next. Scripts often arrived the morning of filming, sometimes still being revised as actors were already in costume. For younger cast members, the pace was overwhelming, but also exhilarating. John Schneider was barely out of his teens. Tom Wopat was still adjusting to the weight of sudden fame. Catherine Bach found herself under intense public scrutiny as Daisy Duke became a cultural phenomenon almost instantly. Everyone was learning in real time, adapting on instinct, doing whatever it took to keep up. James Best watched all of this with growing concern. He understood the need for speed, but he also recognized the cost. Blocking rehearsals were shortened or eliminated entirely. Creative discussions that once helped align performances began to disappear. Scenes were rushed. Adjustments were made mid-take. To some, this chaos felt energetic. To Best, it felt careless. Acting, in his view, required intention. Without preparation, comedy lost its precision, and professionalism began to erode. Crew members noticed how differently he responded to the pressure. While others adapted by loosening their approach, Best doubled down on discipline. He continued arriving early. He insisted on understanding every movement before the camera rolled. He asked lighting crews to follow charts exactly and requested clarity whenever dialogue was altered. These were not demands for control. They were attempts to preserve structure in an environment that was rapidly losing it. The contrast created two rhythms on set. One group relied on instinct, improvisation, and familiarity. The other followed planning, repetition, and structure. At first, these rhythms coexisted without conflict. But as the pace intensified, the gap widened. What had once been a difference in style slowly became a difference in values. By late 1980, the production had reached a breaking point. Ratings remained high, and producers pushed to shorten turnaround times even further. Autograph sessions, interviews, and promotional appearances filled any gaps between shoots. Some cast members began treating filming as routine work rather than performance. Preparation slipped. Focus wavered. James Best noticed everything, but he said very little. Those who worked alongside him recalled subtle changes. He became quieter between takes. He no longer joined casual conversations. His attention narrowed entirely to the work itself. When scenes ran long due to missed cues or improvised lines, he did not argue. He simply requested another take, calmly, professionally. But the patience he was known for began to thin. One crew member later described it as watching a fault line form. There were no shouting matches, no dramatic confrontations, just a growing silence that carried weight. Best's stillness on set felt deliberate, as though he was measuring something, deciding how far he was willing to bend. And then there was one actor whose behavior consistently disrupted the rhythm James had worked so hard to maintain. Late arrivals, unopened scripts, joking during rehearsals, improvisation that undercut timing. None of it was malicious, but to James Best, it represented a lack of respect, not just for him, but for the craft itself. The day everything stopped. By the time the series reached its 4th season, the tension James Best had been carrying quietly was no longer something he could ignore. Fame had settled in, and with it came habits that were harder to correct. What once felt like youthful inexperience now looked like indifference. For James, the issue was no longer pace or pressure, it was respect. The breaking point came during a courthouse scene that required precise timing. It was not a complicated sequence, but it depended on rhythm, cues, and coordination between actors. James Best prepared the way he always did. He stayed up late revising his dialogue, refining pauses, and adjusting movement so the scene would land cleanly. He arrived early the next morning with his script marked and his performance ready. The other actor did not. Nearly an hour passed after call time. The crew waited. Cameras sat idle. Schedules slipped. When the actor finally arrived, there was no apology, no urgency. According to those present, he carried himself casually, smiling as if the delay were insignificant. Someone joked that it was no big deal. Another comment followed, half laughing, suggesting James was overthinking the scene. That was when everything changed. James Best did not raise his voice. He did not argue. He did not lecture. He quietly placed his script on the table. Without a word, he turned and walked off the set. Production stopped instantly. Crew members froze, unsure of how to react. This was not a tantrum. It was not a threat. It was a boundary. An emergency meeting was called inside a production trailer. Producers scrambled to assess the damage. Schedules were already tight, and losing a day of filming was costly. After nearly an hour, the director asked James to return for a private conversation. His response was brief and measured. He said he would not continue filming under those conditions. That single statement ended the day's shoot. The schedule was postponed. Crew members were instructed to remain silent about what had happened. There were no reports to the press, no leaks, no public acknowledgement. Everything was handled quietly, deliberately, and internally. When James Best returned a few days later, the atmosphere had shifted. Adjustments had been made without announcement. Scenes were reorganized. Rehearsals were separated. Line readings no longer happened in the same room. Blocking was revised so that certain interactions were minimized or avoided entirely. No one explained the changes out loud, but everyone understood what they meant. James Best had not quit the show. He had not demanded anyone be fired. He simply refused to work beside one person under circumstances he considered unprofessional. And the production, recognizing both his value and his resolve, adapted. From that moment forward, a quiet rule existed on set. It was never written down. It was never discussed publicly, but it was enforced. James Best would finish the work he committed to, but only on terms that respected his craft. The name no one expected. After the walk-off, the silence was immediate and absolute. No statements were issued, no interviews hinted at trouble. The production moved forward as if nothing unusual had happened. To the public, the Dukes of Hazzard remained a cheerful escape. Behind the scenes, however, everyone knew a line had been crossed, and no one said whose. Rumors began quietly, years later. Fans noticed small things on rewatch. Scenes that once thrived on close interaction now felt oddly spaced. Banter was shorter. Physical proximity diminished. Conversations that should have played as effortless felt stitched together. At conventions, smiles were polite, poses were careful, and eye contact was brief. Nothing dramatic, just distance. Speculation filled the vacuum. Some believed the friction involved the Duke boys. Contract disputes had already put their names in headlines, and youthful confidence was an easy target for blame. Others wondered if pressure around Daisy Duke's sudden cultural impact had created tension. But people who worked on set dismissed those ideas quickly. There was no history of conflict there. Respect had remained intact. Then another name surfaced, one that surprised almost everyone. The actor in question had a gentle reputation. On screen, he was earnest, soft-spoken, and unfailingly kind. His character often stood beside Roscoe, sharing comic beats and call-and-response exchanges that felt natural and warm. Fans loved the pairing. It looked like mentorship turned friendship. That assumption made the truth harder to accept. Crew members began to describe a pattern that had been easy to overlook at the time. Friendly behavior that slipped into distraction, casual jokes during instruction, improvised lines that disrupted carefully planned timing, late arrivals, especially during early calls, that threw off the day's rhythm. None of it was malicious. None of it was cruel. But for James Best, it cut deep. He had spent decades building a method grounded in preparation. He believed comedy worked only when everyone respected the structure. When improvisation undercut a scene he had refined, it wasn't merely inconvenient. It felt dismissive of the work itself. When a light-hearted remark brushed off his concerns, it landed as indifference toward the profession he took seriously, silence, legacy, and what he left behind. After the separation on set became an unspoken rule, James Best never addressed it publicly. He did not name names. He did not revisit the moment in interviews. To many, that silence felt puzzling. In an industry that often rewards confession and controversy, James chose restraint. But for those who knew him, it made perfect sense. He believed that professionalism did not require explanation. As the Dukes of Hazzard continued, the production adapted completely. Scenes were structured to avoid friction. Rehearsals were carefully planned. The illusion of unity held strong on screen, and audiences remained unaware that anything had changed. James Best continued delivering performances with the same precision he always had. Sheriff Roscoe remained energetic, funny, and deeply memorable. His commitment never wavered. When the series ended, James quietly stepped away from the pace of television production. He returned to teaching, opening acting classes where discipline mattered more than ambition. Students were expected to arrive early, know their lines, and respect everyone in the room. He often told them that talent meant nothing without preparation. Acting, in his view, was not about being noticed. It was about being dependable. During those years, he took on smaller projects, painted, and lived without spectacle. When asked about his career, he rarely spoke about conflict. He spoke about work, about effort, about responsibility. Those who studied under him recalled how exacting he could be, correcting small movements or shifts in breath, not to control them, but to help them understand the craft. Many said he taught them more about professionalism than performance. At fan conventions later in life, James Best remained gracious and composed. He smiled easily, signed autographs, and spoke warmly of his time in Hazzard County. When questions drifted toward behind-the-scenes drama, he redirected the conversation. To him, the show was a cherished memory, not a battleground. Even when others spoke respectfully of him, he never corrected narratives or clarified rumors. When James Best passed away at the age of 88, tributes focused on one theme above all others: respect. Co-stars described him as steady and generous. Students remembered him as demanding but fair. Fans remembered laughter. What few realized was that his greatest lesson had nothing to do with comedy. Do you think James Best was right to draw that line, even if it meant working in silence afterward? Or should professionalism allow more compromise behind the scenes? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay with us for more untold stories from television history.